Joshua, as many of you know, is the head of the PERA Project for the Independence Institute. And if you don't know what the Independence Institute is, it is a think tank here in Denver, Colorado. We got it right down in Denver. It's a wonderful facility. He became interested in the public pension problem several years ago and jumped at the chance when approached by former State Representative Penn Pfiffner. I know there's a lot of people in this room that have been motivated to do things because of Penn's persuasive abilities. Since then, he has produced a number of papers on PERA, many of which we linked to on our Facebook event today. So if you're interested in looking into more of those, we've got those. And he continues to speak on this important topic around the state. In addition to working for the Independence Institute, he also co-edits the Colorado Watchdog Wire, a citizen journalism website focused on state and local affairs, and blogs at his own site, View from a Height, and microblogs at Glimpse from a Height. So I actually follow you. I don't know if you know this. I do follow you on Glimpse from a Height. And for those of you who don't like the very verbose political blogs, you'll really like a Glimpse from a Height because it's little snippets of very good information without too much words. So go check that out. Joshua has ran for twice for State House for HD6 in East Denver and now serves as a co-district captain for the Republican Party from that district. He moved to Colorado in 1997 from Northern Virginia after a career working for a variety of defense and intelligence contractors known locally as the Beltway Bandits. Since then, he has been a web developer with a brief stint as a financial analyst for a local brokerage. He holds a master's degree in finance and an MBA from the University of Denver and a bachelor's degree of science in physics from the University of Virginia. With that, please help me welcome up Joshua Sharf.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you very much, Mike. This is really a tremendous group, and it's a tremendous size group. It's really impressive and really a relief and an inspiration to be able to come out and see this many liberty-minded folks outside of Denver, outside of the big population center, people willing to drive and get here and come together and talk about this stuff. And it really is a testament to their persistence and their persuasiveness and their marketing skills and y'all's interest and willingness to be engaged in these things. It's really something, exactly the kind of group that, wow, that's great. Really exactly the kind of group that I love talking to. In addition to, sort of the normal squishy political stuff, people who really like digging their teeth into the numbers and really like talking about financial topics. I know that when I first scheduled this, I hadn't realized Brian said that I went to University of Virginia, and I hadn't realized that Virginia was going to be playing Duke, and they're on upstairs. And fortunately, I'm not missing anything. I checked the score just before because they're playing Duke. So fortunately, I'm not missing the game up there. And I'll tell you, Brian mentioned that I first started blogging about PERA, blogging about public pensions a couple of years ago. That's when it sort of started to hit the radar. A fellow named Andrew Biggs, writing for American Enterprise Institute, began putting some stuff out. And thinking about, let's take a look at Colorado's PERA plan, and let's see what kind of shape that we're in here. And as a result, I've kept this up. Penn Pfiffner was instrumental in bringing me into the Independence Institute and putting their resources at my disposal. When they've been tremendous, they have been just a phenomenal organization. If you ever get a chance to work with them, they're great. Ben is an editor, and then the senior policy guy, Dave Kopel, just really good guys to work with. And as a result, over the last 2 years or so, probably not a week has gone by where I haven't learned something about public pensions, which gives you a little sense about what my life is like. So let's go ahead and I think most of the tables I'm going to have to ask you to share. These are color copies, and I didn't bring enough for everyone, of course. But let's go ahead and start taking a look at those of you that have these, and those of you who don't, I'll just hold up the slide. This is PERA's funded level. All right? This is the funded level, the degree to which PERA has assets able to cover its long-term liabilities. Now, this is as of 2012. Generally, PERA doesn't issue its audited financial statements until the end of June each year, conveniently after the end of the legislative session. And it takes about 6 months for them to put this together. So in a few months, in about 5 months, we'll be seeing next, the ones that'll bring you up to date through the end of 2013. The red line is the percentage to which PERA is funded. As I say, the degree to which they have assets able to cover the liabilities. The blue line is the dollars per person for the unfunded liability. And you can see that that number has been rising in general. Now, it goes down in good years, but on the whole, since about 2000 or so, that number has been rising. And it is currently at about just under $2,000 per Colorado resident. That, by the way, is man, woman, and child. That's per Colorado resident. That's a lot of money. And that's just the unfunded liability in constant $1983 that we have that. All right. So it's probably, it's significantly more than that now, obviously, in current dollars. The reason we use $1983 is because then you're able to get a sense of how much this is really growing. Use a constant dollar amount. Why is this important? It's important not just because of dollars and cents. We all understand dollars and cents. We understand that it's bad to be in debt. It's bad to have obligations that you can't cover. But what is beyond that? What's the moral sense of this? Basically, it's unfair. It's unfair to three groups of people. It's unfair to retirees because it's immoral to make promises that you're not going to be able to keep. It's unfair to the taxpayers because eventually we're the people who are going to be asked either to make do without services or to pay higher taxes. And it's unfair to the future members of PERA who are going to be asked to take cuts in their own benefits or to put more into the system in order to pay for people who have already retired. Basically, this has real impacts on people. This isn't just, dollars that make it harder to run the government or dollars that end up coming out of our pockets. This has real effects on people, and it's always important to keep that in mind. So why is PERA underfunded? It's underfunded basically for three or four reasons. First, the state has been shorting PERA on its annual required contribution. And that's an amount that's set by the legislature. In essence, it's calculated in order to keep PERA, it's calculated according to fairly solid accounting rules, in order to keep PERA, keep the things solvent. And it's a formula based on benefits and based on expected inflation, of course, the various actuarial measures, how many people are going to retire, how many people are going to die, and so forth, how many people are going to leave the system and leave money in the system when they leave. And so the state has an annual contribution that it has to make. Well, the individual districts can't short their contributions, but the state legislature can its, and that's part of the reason that it's underfunded. But it's not the main reason. We'll see other reasons. We'll see the other contributions. In particular, there have been overly generous benefits. I know we have at least one PERA retiree here who may disagree with me on that, but there really are two specific sources of these benefits that really have contributed disproportionately to PERA's underfunding. In particular, in early retirement age and also pension spiking, where in the past, and this has been fixed for the most part, but we're still living with the promises that were made as a result of it in the past, where somebody could save their retirement or could save their vacation and then take it at the end, or they could take a bunch of raises, be eligible for, and get a bunch of raises right at the end. And that would raise the last year's salary, which used to be purely the last year. Now it's calculated as an average over 3 years. But the base salary on which benefits are calculated. So somebody could work at a lower salary for most of their career, have a spike right at the end of their career, and have salary that count as the salary on which their benefits are calculated. There was a fire sale, and this was under, unfortunately, we have to admit this was under Governor Owens, the fire sale on what's called purchase service credit. So if you had worked for, say, 22 years, but there was a benefit plateau, a benefit raise for having worked 25 years, you could purchase those 3 years of service credit. You still can. The price now is much more reflective of the actual value that you get out of it, But in order to encourage turnover in the state government, Governor Owens encouraged the PERA board to, and he couldn't mandate it, but he encouraged the PERA board to lower the price of the service credit. So it became very cheap to purchase those extra 3 years and then go ahead and retire. As a result, again, benefits were being paid out that hadn't been accounted for by money coming in. And then the last reason was that prior to 2000, PERA basically put a lot of chips on stocks, put a lot of chips on equities, and let it ride. And as a result, we had terribly poor asset allocation. We ended up with over 70%, over 75% of PERA's assets being in U.S. equities just before 2000. We all remember what happened in March of 2000. And as a result, suddenly money that was in the bank was no longer in the bank. That also has been more or less rectified, but we're still living with the consequences of it. We're still living with the fact that it's underfunded as a result of those decisions. And you can see that here. You can see how high that got it got up to almost 75%, the red line on the bottom, the percent that was in stocks. And when that started to fall, what had been 105% funding fell to below 65% funding. Yes?
So there's 179 fiefdoms that the scale goes up, and a lot of those, if you look at the Boulder Valley School District, for instance, and look at how many superintendents we've had over the last 12 years, 4, seems like they spend their 3 years at the highest rate that they can get, and then they retire.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It probably is not, the high earners are probably not the bulk of the problem. That said, it's remarkably unfair that somebody like Cindy Stevenson is going to be getting $200,000 a year for the rest of her life. She's the outgoing superintendent of Jeffco Public Schools, and she's going to get $200,000 a year as her benefit for the rest of her life. So high earners are demoralizing, and it's unfair to people to have to pay that out. But it's not really the bulk of the problem because most people don't see that much. But that's a good point. That's a good point. If you turn to the contributions shortfall, you'll see, and this is an interesting chart. It shows the amount that should have been paid in, and then the total return up until now of what that would have been. And you can see that there's a considerable amount of underpayment. However, it's not the bulk of it. Because if you look here, you can see that the difference between being fully funded by the state legislature, having the ARC fully paid by the state legislature, and what was actually paid, they're still, even if they had made all of their payments as required by law, it still would have been significantly underfunded. You did bring up the schools, and one of the problems with PERA is that it is beginning now, especially in terms of how much money it's taking out of the school districts, it's beginning to significantly affect the operating budgets of school districts. It's the PERA contributions have been growing much, much faster in school districts than inflation, and that's been happening for some time. This is for some of the larger school districts right around Denver. And you can see that the cumulative average growth rate from, what do I have here? Over the last, I guess this is since 2006. The cumulative average growth rate statewide has been over 9%, just about 9%. Okay. That's a huge number. 9% a year. Every year, PERA's contribution has been going up by the school districts. On a per student basis, Cherry Creek is the worst, has the worst situation. They've been going up 8.6% per year per student since 2006 through 2012. Statewide, it's not quite so bad. It's about 7.8%. Okay. Now, we all know that inflation is probably a little bit higher than the CPI would indicate, but it's not 7.8%. As a result, as a percentage of operating expenses, you now have every one of those school districts is above over 10%. Okay, these are operating expenses. This doesn't include capital expenses. This doesn't include financing, meaning paying off debt. Okay. These are operating expenses. Over 10%, approaching 12%. Now, how does that happen? That happens because in 2009, there was a bill passed, SB 1, 2010, SB 1, which mandated certain changes, mandated certain increases in what the school districts had to pay. And what has happened is that they had these supplementary payments that they began paying in 2006. In 2010, those were increased. There was an additional supplementary payment that they're required to pay. The idea was that they would split that between themselves and the teachers. What's happened is that almost every school district, with the exception of, I think, possibly Falcon, but certainly Adams 12, every other school district has basically eaten that entirely and said that as the employers, they will pay that entire supplemental payment. Well, these are significant numbers. And eventually the total amount is going to amount to a little over, about 23% of salary is going to have to go, of an individual salary is going to end up going into PERA. All right. This is a huge number. Those are all the payments together. That's the normal payment, the supplementary payment, the additional supplementary payment. These are huge numbers. Okay. I don't know how much you put into your retirement plans on your own. You're putting your 401ks or your 457Bs if you happen to be in that kind of a plan. I'm guessing it's probably not 25 cents on the dollar of your salary, even with whatever company match you might end up getting. So what's happened is that it's harder to cover the costs. It's harder to cover the costs because you have a certain, property tax base. You have a certain income that the state is generating. If you're talking about the state contributions, you'd have a certain GDP that's being generated. And what's happening is that the unfunded liability, that is the obligations greater than the assets that we have on hand to meet them, continues to grow. Remember that chart back in the beginning with the unfundedness growing? Okay. As a percentage of Colorado GDP, you can see. So the blue bars are the GDP. The line is the unfunded liability. Now, it doesn't match that. I mean, these are different scales. And on the bottom, you can see that little irritatingly growing red bar. And that's the percentage of the Colorado GDP that is the PERA unfunded liability. Now, understand, and then this is important, I was actually asked to make this clear, nobody is going to come knocking at the door tomorrow and say, we need all of this right now. That can't happen. But, in finance, one of the reasonable things that you look at is debt coverage, is being able to cover your debts. And one of the measures that you use is income and then the size of the debt that you have. And if that number is going in the wrong direction, analysts get a little bit worried. And that number is going in the wrong direction. And so analysts are a little bit worried. Another issue is the number of PERA participants versus the number of retirees. Now, part of this is made worse by the fact that the retirement age is quite young. The average, Greg Smith, who's the executive director of PERA, likes to talk about the fact that the average retiree is 61 years old. I'm not going to get Social Security until I'm, 67, 68, 70, if they end up raising it to that. Retiring at 61 is kind of a sweet deal. As a result, the number of retirees the number of people working per retiree has fallen from, what do I have here? From 3.5 to about 2. That means with fewer people paying into the system, the burden for making this up is going to fall on the taxpayers. And to the extent that it falls on the employees, it's going to fall even harder on the employees. So again, remember the three groups of people to whom this is most unfair. It's unfair to retirees because you're going to have people or people near retirement. Because these are people who have made financial decisions based on promises that they were made. They're in a position now where they're 65 or 60. And it's very difficult to change course. It's very difficult to be told, well, half of what you were promised isn't going to show up, and then change direction and be able to make that up. It's late in the game for them. It's unfair to taxpayers because whatever disagreements people in the room may have about the proper role of government, the fact is that we can't even have that conversation if it starts squeezing out other things that we do want to spend money on. And the only way that you stay solvent is to continue to raise debt. And you end up in the death spiral, or you end up in the Illinois or the California or the New York death spiral, people leaving the state because taxes are too high in order to support an unsupportable structure that you can't do anything about. And then, of course, the future members, the people who are going to go work for the state government, and they're going to find that their benefits are cut. They're going to find that they have to pay a disproportionate amount out of their salaries, out of their employee contribution, in order to pay for people who are already retired. It's also an issue for schools. Now, the largest fund, PERA is divided up into 5 different funds. The 2 biggest funds are the state fund, which is the state employees, and the school fund. It's also difficult for schools. Assuming that we continue to have public schools, I know there's probably some disagreement in this room about whether or not that's a good thing. But assuming for the moment that we're going to continue to have public schools, you want good teachers in there. Well, it's very difficult to attract good teachers if you can't pay them in current salary what you would like to be able to because they're too busy funding people who are already retired. Part of the compensation package is calculated that way, and it's very difficult to tell people, you're going to have to, you're not going to be able to pay people what we think they're worth because we're too busy paying off prior obligations. Also, and this is really true, this is the basic problem with a defined benefit plan as opposed to a defined contribution plan. Defined benefit plan is a promise. When you own a piece of a pension, you own a piece of a promise. That promise is only as good as the funding. When you have a defined contribution plan, you own an asset. You can look at it, you can see how big that asset is, you can see where you might want to invest it. You know exactly where you stand. Isn't that fundamentally more fair than making people a promise? Of course. You have a piece of an asset. So there were some reforms in SB 10. I won't go over them in great detail right now. Basically, it ended up cutting the inflation. Before, basically, there was inflation cap that was quite high. Now it's been cut to 2%. So no matter what inflation is, the cost of living adjustment can't be more than 2%. Per year. Obviously, we've already talked about the increases that employers have been told that they have to pay. It also eliminated what was called double dipping. I was in one of the great coffee. I don't want to plug another place. There's a really nice coffee shop near Capitol Hill, and I go in there and have a cup of coffee. And you sit and listen to me, and then a lot of other people go in there and have a cup of coffee. I'm listening to these teachers from Canyon City. This is back in 2009, talking about how they retired and they're getting PERA, and they turn right around and go back to work for the school district as contractors. Or even or they go to work for a different district as employees. That's what's called double dipping. The problem is obvious. These are people who are supposed to be retired. Not only are they now acquiring additional PERA benefits, but of course they're taking money off the table as well, directly in terms of salary. So that was a problem, and that was put an end to as well. There have been some other, and again in the packets there, and I won't go into great detail right now. We can talk a little bit more about what bills might be coming up or what bills might make sense. There have been some bills that have been proposed to try and deal with this, and most of them have been shot down in the last couple of years. These include bills to do a little more honest accounting in terms of using the proper discount rate for the liability. They've included bills to have more frequent or quicker reporting on the investments and on the annual report. There have been a number of things that have been suggested. One of the bright spots about all this is that whatever we may think of Hickenlooper, and trust me, I share the general opinion in this room of Hickenlooper, he has taken this problem relatively seriously, and it does appear that he understands the problem here, that this is going to be a problem for state government, and it's going to be a problem for the citizens of the state. I had a chance to meet a few weeks ago with his budget director, and the impression that I got was that he understands that this is not good, and that it's going to have a severe impact on the budgets come down the road. And so they proposed 3 studies that be done in order to try to get a handle on the size of the problem. They want to do a study on a conversion to a defined contribution plan. They'd like to do a study on what the state contribution, this included, what the state compensation package looks like compared to the private sector, and how well that compares as well. And so they've made a real effort to take this seriously and try to come up with to try to get a handle on how big the problem is. They also want to have an improved, what they call a dashboard. Basically, the idea is to try to get some metrics on how well PERA is funded, what the direction is going, and so we get some more real financial numbers in there, because I don't think they're very happy with the quality of the financial reporting that's coming either. Not that it's dishonest, but that it's not complete enough to be able to get a handle on whether or not things are going bad if we sort of have this plan to get back on track. SB 10 was supposed to be that plan to get back on track, but the amortization period, which had been coming down, they lowered just recently the expected rate of return from what was probably a somewhat unreasonable 8% a year. Don't laugh. This is it's actually not as unreasonable as you would think, and I'll explain why in a second. To 7.5%. That was pretty contentious, but they did that. And of course, it ended up increasing both the unfunded liability and the amortization period, the number of years that it will take to get back to being fully funded. It's a ridiculous number of years, and that's where the problem comes in. Okay? You're talking about a 35, now possibly over a 40-year amortization period. The problem with the 8% isn't that that's necessarily unrealistic over that period of time. The problem with it is that you have to make payments every year. So if, as we had in 2008, a bad year in the market, a really bad year, what ends up happening? You end up eating your seed corn. There's so much variability in that 8% that if you have a bad year, you end up eating your principal that you were planning on growing. It's not that you can't average 8% over 40 years. It's completely unrealistic to expect that you're going to know what's going to happen for each and every one of those 40 years. You're not going to get you're not going to get 8% every one of those years. And so one bad year can really do a lot more damage than a series of good years can do good. That's the problem with the 8%. So ultimately, the last page here is the Joshua Sharf 3-point plan for dealing with the problems of PERA. One is to raise the retirement age. Basically, it's only fair. PERA retirees should be able to, it's a substitute for Social Security. They don't get Social Security. This is a substitute for Social Security. But the retirement age should be gradually raised to meet the Social Security retirement age. It's a strange formula. It's like that's a good question. It's a formula of, some have a rule of 88, some a rule of 85, some a rule of 90, and that's age plus number of years worked to get full benefits. And if you have less than that, then you get some percentage of the benefits. So, somebody who is out of school at 30, somebody who starts working for the state at 30 and works until they're 60, well, they put in 30 years, and so they'll meet the rule of 90 requirement, and they'll end up being able to retire at age 60. The second is to convert to a defined contribution plan or a deferred compensation plan. Now, this won't get rid of the unfunded liability, but it will keep it from growing. because again, you're converting from a promise to an asset. There's maybe some legal issues involved with that, but there are also political issues involved with that because the promise looks really good on paper. And there's a sense that this is a contractual obligation, that once the state makes this promise, they're on the hook for it. So people don't want to give that up. Part of the opposition also comes from PERA itself, because they're afraid that if you go and do this, that you're not going to need them anymore. Now, I'm not one necessarily I'm not necessarily sympathetic to that argument from an institutional point of view, but I do understand that you have to sort of work around the politics of that. If you have the organization themselves up on Capitol Hill arguing against every reform because they're afraid that it's going to cost them their jobs, then it makes it that much harder to get it passed. So one of the things, and again, understanding whatever it costs, the cost of running PERA is not the reason PERA is in trouble. These other things are the reason PERA is in trouble. The cost of running PERA is not the reason PERA is in trouble. So they already have what's called a 457B plan. What is that? They manage the money. It's in one of these as your cohort ages, then it moves into progressively more conservative. That's a phrase you don't hear put together very often, is it? Progressively more conservative investments. And so then by the time you retire, it's basically in cash or in something, or in T-bill, something that's secure. So you could leave it in that. You could leave it in that and say, listen, you guys still have the obligation to do the stock management of a certain percentage going to be in equities. You still got to go do the portfolio diversification. You still have to make sure that this is invested the way we expect it to be invested. It's just not going to be a promise. It's going to be the asset, and however much money you get that's in the fund when you retire, you get your piece of it. You retire and the fund is worth this much, and 10,000 people retire that year and you get 1/10,000th of it. Right? So you could still do it that way. And I think that overcomes a lot of the political fear on the part of PERA itself. And the last thing is to do an honest accounting of the discount rate. Right now they're using a discount rate that's too high. It makes the unfunded liability look too small. It makes the liability, valued back to today's dollars, look too small. As a result, it makes it look like PERA is even better funded than it is, and it doesn't look like it's very well funded. But if you put the proper discount rate in there, people would get really scared, and then you would start to see a lot more political motion behind some of these other reforms. So I wasn't looking over. Unfortunately, I wasn't looking over at Mike. I don't know if I've overstepped my time. He's giving me the cut sign now. So,
no, you're fine.
But we'll go ahead. That's it. That's what I have, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.